The possible removal of U.S. forces from a major Middle Eastern base represents far more than a bilateral disagreement between two governments. It reflects a deep structural shift in the global balance of power. For much of the past century, international politics has operated under the assumption that a small number of dominant nations could shape outcomes through military reach and economic pressure. That assumption is now being challenged by the rise of regional powers, diversified alliances, and new economic centers that no longer rely exclusively on Western leadership. This shift toward a multipolar world means influence is no longer concentrated in one capital or one alliance system. Countries across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America are building independent diplomatic networks, expanding regional trade agreements, and investing in domestic industries that reduce dependency on foreign military protection. As these nations strengthen their economic foundations, they gain leverage in negotiations and become more selective about long term security arrangements. The ability to say no to powerful partners is itself a sign of growing geopolitical confidence. At the same time, traditional power structures are being weakened by internal pressures. Rising public debt, political polarization, and social inequality within major powers reduce their capacity to project authority abroad. When domestic populations question the value of endless foreign engagements, governments face increasing resistance to maintaining large overseas footprints. This internal tension creates openings for host nations to renegotiate relationships that were once considered permanent and untouchable. Technology has also accelerated this transformation. Information flows instantly across borders, allowing countries to learn from each other's development models and security strategies. Cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, and economic connectivity now play a role equal to, and sometimes greater than, conventional military force. As power becomes more decentralized, control over territory loses some of its historical importance, while control over data, trade routes, and innovation ecosystems gains prominence. Regional cooperation further reinforces this trend. Middle Eastern nations, for example, are increasingly investing in joint infrastructure projects, energy partnerships, and cross border trade corridors. These efforts reduce reliance on external military guarantors and encourage local solutions to regional challenges. When neighboring states collaborate on economic stability and development, they create alternative forms of security rooted in mutual prosperity rather than foreign troop presence. This evolving landscape does not suggest the disappearance of major powers, but it does signal a redefinition of their role. Instead of commanding compliance, influence now depends on adaptability, credibility, and economic engagement. Nations that fail to adjust to this reality risk being perceived as out of touch with modern geopolitical dynamics. The headline about potential base closures therefore serves as a visible marker of a deeper transformation, one in which authority is distributed across multiple centers of power, alliances are fluid rather than fixed, and global leadership is shaped by negotiation rather than domination. Foreign military bases are often presented to the public as purely defensive structures designed to ensure stability and deter conflict. In reality, they function as complex economic and political agreements that resemble long term business contracts more than permanent security commitments. These arrangements involve payments, infrastructure investments, employment opportunities, logistical support, and access to strategic locations. When viewed through this lens, a military base is not just a collection of runways and barracks, but a financial ecosystem that ties the interests of two governments together. Host nations frequently calculate the benefits and costs of these agreements in strictly economic terms. On the positive side, bases can bring jobs, construction projects, service contracts, and local spending that stimulate surrounding communities. They can also provide access to advanced technology, training programs, and international partnerships. However, these benefits are weighed against significant trade offs, including land use restrictions, political pressure, security risks, and limitations on national autonomy. As economies evolve and alternative revenue streams grow, the financial incentive to host foreign forces can diminish. For the countries operating these bases, the economics are equally important. Maintaining overseas installations requires enormous budgets for personnel, transportation, equipment maintenance, and infrastructure upgrades. These costs are often justified as necessary investments in global influence and strategic advantage. Yet they also represent long term financial obligations that compete with domestic spending priorities. As public scrutiny increases, governments face growing pressure to justify why billions of dollars are allocated abroad while domestic needs remain unmet. The political dimension of these arrangements further complicates the picture. Hosting a foreign base can affect a nation's diplomatic relationships with neighboring countries and global partners. It can create perceptions of alignment or dependence that influence trade negotiations, regional cooperation, and international reputation. At the same time, base hosting agreements are frequently used as bargaining tools, allowing host nations to negotiate economic aid, arms deals, or political support in exchange for continued access. This transactional nature reveals an important reality. Military presence is rarely permanent. It is conditional, negotiated, and subject to revision when circumstances change. Economic downturns, leadership transitions, public opinion shifts, and regional conflicts can all trigger reevaluations of these agreements. When host nations become more economically self sufficient, they gain leverage to demand better terms or reconsider whether the arrangement still serves national interests. Global competition also plays a role in reshaping these contracts. As multiple powers seek strategic footholds in key regions, host countries are no longer limited to a single partner. This creates a marketplace of influence where access, infrastructure, and cooperation are negotiated among several competing actors. In this environment, military bases become part of a broader economic and diplomatic negotiation process rather than fixed symbols of dominance. Understanding foreign bases as economic agreements rather than permanent security guarantees changes how we interpret international headlines. It highlights the reality that strategic partnerships are driven by shifting financial incentives, political calculations, and national priorities, and that these arrangements remain vulnerable to renegotiation as the global economic and political landscape continues to evolve. The traditional belief that military strength alone guarantees global influence is increasingly disconnected from modern reality. For decades, power was measured by the number of troops deployed overseas, the size of defense budgets, and the reach of military hardware. While these factors still matter, they no longer operate as the primary determinants of international leadership. In today's interconnected world, influence is shaped by a broader set of tools that extend far beyond the battlefield. Economic strength now stands at the center of global competition. Countries that control major supply chains, dominate key industries, and attract foreign investment possess leverage that cannot be matched by military force alone. Trade agreements, technological exports, and financial partnerships often determine diplomatic alignment more effectively than military alliances. When nations depend on each other for resources, manufacturing, and markets, economic interdependence becomes a powerful stabilizing force that reshapes political decision making. Diplomacy has also evolved into a more complex and strategic process. Successful nations invest heavily in regional partnerships, cultural exchanges, humanitarian initiatives, and multilateral institutions. These efforts build long term trust and credibility, allowing countries to influence global agendas without resorting to coercion. Soft power, the ability to attract rather than force cooperation, has become a critical component of modern statecraft. Nations that fail to cultivate this influence risk isolation even if their military capabilities remain strong. Public legitimacy plays an equally important role. Governments that face internal unrest, social division, or declining public confidence struggle to project authority abroad. International partners are less likely to align with nations perceived as unstable or politically divided. Domestic credibility strengthens foreign policy effectiveness by demonstrating consistency, accountability, and institutional reliability. When citizens trust their leadership, governments gain greater freedom to engage constructively on the global stage. Technological innovation further limits the effectiveness of traditional military first strategies. Cyber warfare, digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and space based systems have transformed the nature of conflict and competition. Control over data networks and digital platforms can influence elections, markets, and public opinion across borders without the deployment of a single soldier. This shift forces governments to rethink what security actually means in a digital age. Additionally, global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and economic instability cannot be solved through military action. These threats require cooperation, scientific investment, and coordinated policy responses. Nations that prioritize collaborative solutions gain moral authority and international support, strengthening their global standing more effectively than unilateral military action. As the world becomes more interconnected, reliance on force alone increasingly produces diminishing returns. Military dominance without economic resilience, diplomatic credibility, and public trust creates fragile influence that is easily challenged by rising powers and shifting alliances. The most effective strategies today combine security capabilities with economic development, technological leadership, and cooperative diplomacy, reflecting a broader understanding of what true power looks like in the modern international system. Maintaining an extensive overseas military presence carries a significant domestic cost that is often hidden from public discussion. Every foreign base requires continuous funding for personnel salaries, housing, equipment maintenance, transportation, fuel, security operations, and infrastructure upgrades. These expenses accumulate into massive long term financial commitments that stretch national budgets and reduce the resources available for domestic development. While these expenditures are justified under the banner of national security, their opportunity cost is rarely examined with the seriousness it deserves. At home, many nations face aging infrastructure, overcrowded schools, underfunded healthcare systems, and growing economic inequality. Roads, bridges, public transit systems, and water networks require modernization, yet funding shortages persist. When billions of dollars are allocated to maintain distant military installations, it raises critical questions about national priorities. Investment choices reflect political values, and the balance between global military expansion and domestic social stability continues to spark debate across the political spectrum. The strain is also felt by working families. Rising living costs, housing shortages, and stagnant wages place increasing pressure on households. Public investment in affordable housing, job training programs, and community development could provide long term economic stability and social mobility. However, when defense budgets dominate fiscal planning, these initiatives often receive limited funding or face repeated delays. The result is a growing disconnect between government spending patterns and everyday public needs. Long-term military commitments abroad can also generate indirect domestic costs. Veterans returning from overseas deployments require health care, mental health services, and reintegration support. These programs are essential but expensive, adding another layer of financial responsibility that continues long after conflicts or deployments end. Without adequate planning and funding, support systems become overstretched, leaving many service members and their families struggling to access necessary care. Economic sustainability is another major concern. Heavy defense spending can contribute to national debt, limiting future policy flexibility. As interest payments increase, governments face tighter budgets that constrain public investment in education, research, and innovation. These sectors are crucial for maintaining long term economic competitiveness, and underfunding them weakens a country's ability to adapt to technological